Everyone at that fundraiser gala went quiet for a second. Then somebody started clapping like my daughter had said something clever instead of something cruel. The event coordinator walked over, holding a clipboard with the vendor payment forms, and asked me, right there in front of 200 people, whether I was with catering. I looked at my daughter. I looked at that clipboard. Then I signed my name on the line where it asked for the account holder, set the pen down without a word, and walked out through the kitchen exit into the parking lot. Not one person in that ballroom knew whose name was actually on the deed to the building they were standing in. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a machinist at a stamping plant outside Youngstown, Ohio. The kind of job where you come home with metal shavings in the creases of your knuckles no matter how many times you scrub them. I raised my daughter Renee mostly by myself after her mother passed when Renee was 8. I never had much by way of appearances. Same recliner in my living room for going on 20 years. Same truck, patched up more times than I can count. But I built something real with what I had. And that gala is where I finally understood just how invisible I'd let myself become inside my own daughter's life. Diane died in late October, the kind of fast cancer that doesn't give you time to prepare, just time to watch. Renee was 8, old enough to understand her mother wasn't coming back, but too young to know what to do with that understanding. I remember standing in the kitchen the morning after the funeral, still in the same shirt I'd worn to the service, trying to figure out how to braid hair from a video on a library computer because I didn't know anybody who could teach me and I was too proud to ask. I never sat Renee down and told her how scared I was. I just made the lunches and drove her to dance recitals and sat through parent-teacher conferences, where teachers mostly wanted to tell me she talked too much during quiet reading time. That was the job. I did the job. Money was tight in a way I never let her see. I remember a stretch where I ate the same reheated chili 4 nights running so she could have new sneakers before school pictures. I told myself that was just what fathers did, that the sacrifice wasn't supposed to be visible, that a kid shouldn't have to carry the weight of knowing what things cost. Looking back now, I think that was where I made my first mistake, though it wouldn't show itself for another 20-some years. Renee grew up watching me leave the house every morning in steel-toed boots and a company jacket with a stamping plant logo on the chest, and somewhere along the way, without me catching it happening, she started to feel a certain kind of embarrassed by that. Kids don't always separate a hard life from a small life. Renee mixed the two together early, and I didn't notice the mixture setting until it had already hardened. By the time she hit high school, she'd stopped bringing friends home. Said the house was too far out, too plain, nothing to do there. I think it was really about my truck, parked in the driveway with a dent in the tailgate. I never bothered fixing, and the lunch pail I carried that never quite lost the smell of the plant floor. I told myself it was a phase. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't understand how wrong for a long time yet. Renee found her calling in numbers the way some kids find it in sports or music. She was the kind of sharp where teachers would call home just to tell me, unprompted, that she'd caught an error in a textbook problem that the textbook itself had gotten wrong. She talked about markets and interest rates the way other teenagers talked about music groups, and I didn't understand half of what she said, but I loved watching her face light up saying it. When she told me she wanted to study finance and eventually start her own advisory firm, I told her I'd back her no matter what it cost me, and it cost me plenty. I picked up overtime shifts on the stamping line for years, working doubles when they'd let me, covering what her scholarships didn't reach so she could graduate without the debt hanging over her. She came out of business school with a degree, a head full of plans, and no patience for spending a decade climbing someone else's ladder the way I told her most people did it. She was 24. No real credit history to speak of, no track record a bank could point to, and every lender in the county turned her down flat when she tried to open her own advisory practice. That's when she came to me one evening at my kitchen table, nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her since she was small, and asked whether I still owned the house outright. I did, paid off free and clear 11 years earlier, the one thing in my life that was entirely mine, no bank holding any piece of it. She needed collateral. She needed somebody with clean credit and an asset a lender could actually secure a loan against. And there was exactly one person in her life who fit that description. I didn't think twice. I told her yes before she'd even gotten all the way through, explaining the paperwork, and I meant it with everything I had. What I didn't understand yet was that saying yes was going to cost me a great deal more than the house. I put my home up as collateral and signed a personal guarantee on a business line of credit worth $1.8 million, a number that still makes something twist in my chest whenever I think about it directly. The bank wanted more than a signature on a guarantee, though. They wanted actual skin in the game, something with weight behind it. So my attorney structured it as a holding company where I retained a 35% ownership stake, silent and strictly on paper, while Renee held the rest and ran the day to day. That same night, she asked me for one more thing. And looking back, that request should have told me everything I needed to hear if I'd been willing to listen closely enough. She asked if we could keep my ownership stake out of the public story. Clients liked a founder narrative, she said. A sharp young woman who'd built something out of nothing purely on brains and nerve. And having her machinist father listed as a 35% owner would complicate that narrative considerably. She wanted people to believe she'd done every bit of it herself. I told myself it was just branding, the kind of strategic thinking young business owners have to think about, and I agreed to stay quiet about it. The firm was called Ashcroft Capital Partners, and it opened in a renovated storefront downtown, with glass walls and her name etched into the door in gold lettering. I stood near the back on opening night in the one blazer I owned, watching my daughter shake hands with local business leaders like she'd been raised among them her whole life. Nobody introduced me as anything beyond a family friend who'd come to show support. I told myself it didn't matter, that watching her succeed was payment enough. For a long stretch of years, I actually believed that. Ashcroft Capital took off faster than either of us had expected. Within 4 years, Renee had opened 2 satellite offices, one across the state line and one downtown, in a taller building with her name on a directory listing in the lobby. Regional business journals started running features on her as one of the youngest advisory firm founders in the state, the self-made woman who'd built a client base from nothing but sharp instincts and relentless work. Every article told some version of that same story, and every single time I read one, I noticed my name wasn't anywhere in it. Not even a passing mention of a father who'd remortgaged a paid-off house to make any of it possible. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a great many things were fine back then. It was around that stretch of years that Renee met Preston Callahan at an industry mixer one of her firm's biggest clients had hosted. The Callahans were old money out of the state capital, the kind of family with a wing named after them at the regional hospital and a lake house that had belonged to 3 generations before Preston. His father, Gordon Callahan, had built an insurance empire from a single storefront office decades earlier. And he was the sort of man who measured people almost entirely by whether they'd built what they had with their own 2 hands or had it handed to them. Renee slid into that world with an ease that surprised even me, wearing it like she'd always belonged there. When Renee and Preston married the following spring at a country club outside the capital, I sat at a table near the back with a couple of Renee's old business school classmates, watching her introduce me to Gordon Callahan, simply as a family friend who'd been kind to her over the years. Not her father, just a friend. I remember shaking Gordon's hand, smiling, telling him it was a beautiful ceremony, while something in my chest quietly cracked in a spot I didn't yet have the words for. I told myself she had her reasons, that maybe things would settle once the wedding excitement wore off. It never settled. It only kept sliding further that direction, and I let it keep sliding because some old part of me still believed being needed quietly beat not being needed at all. 6 years passed that way. Me showing up to holidays and birthdays as a background presence, Renee barely acknowledged whenever the Callahans were in the room, and me telling myself every single time that it was fine. Then in early spring, Renee called and invited me to a fundraising gala her firm was co-hosting to celebrate Gordon Callahan's 70th birthday, held in the grand ballroom of the same downtown building where her flagship office sat on the 12th floor. She said it mattered to her that I be there, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel a small, foolish flicker of hope that maybe this time would be different, that maybe this time she'd finally say the word father out loud in front of people who mattered to her. I'd been out on an emergency repair job that entire week, filling in for a buddy whose crew was short-handed on a factory floor 2 counties over, and I didn't have time to drive home and change before heading downtown for the gala. I showed up in my work jacket and boots. Grease still worked into the creases of my hands no matter how hard I'd scrubbed them in a gas station bathroom, because I figured an invitation from my own daughter meant more than what I happened to be wearing. I drove 90 minutes straight from that factory floor to the ballroom, tired and hungry, and honestly a little giddy to see her and the 2 grandkids I barely got real time with anymore. Walking up to the entrance of that building, the same building Renee had built with my signature and my house sitting behind it as collateral, I felt something like the pride mixed with nerves I used to get, walking her into her first day of kindergarten. Through the tall glass doors, I could see the ballroom already filling up, round tables dressed in white linen, string lights strung along the ceiling, servers moving through with trays of champagne. I straightened my jacket as best I could, took a breath, and walked through those front doors toward my daughter and whatever was waiting for me inside. The woman at the check-in table recognized my name right away and waved me through without asking for an invitation. Since I'd been to enough of these Ashcroft events over the years that the regular staff knew my face by now. Stepping into that ballroom felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Soft lighting, expensive perfume drifting through the air, servers gliding between tables. The Callahans were clustered near the head table, dressed like they'd walked straight out of a magazine spread. Gordon at the center in a tailored charcoal suit, laughing at something his son-in-law had just said. Renee spotted me first. I watched her face shift, the warm hostess smile she'd been wearing for her in-laws, sliding sideways into something tighter, something careful. She crossed the room fast, nearly knocking into a server's tray on her way over. Dad, she said, low and quick, the kind of quiet meant to keep the words between just the two of us. What are you doing here dressed like that? I told her I'd come straight from a job site, that I hadn't had time to change, that I was sorry if my clothes weren't right for the room. She glanced back over her shoulder toward the Callahan table, and I watched Gordon's wife lean toward another woman and murmur something behind a raised hand, both of them glancing our way afterward. Gordon himself was watching too, his expression unreadable in that particular way. People with real money get when they're deciding whether something deserves their attention at all. Renee's jaw tightened, and I could see her running some kind of calculation behind her eyes, weighing her father against the family she'd married into, and I could see exactly which side of that scale she was landing on before she opened her mouth again. Whatever warmth I'd carried in from that factory floor started draining out of me right there near the entrance, 90 minutes of driving suddenly sitting heavy in my legs. Her voice came out sharper than I'd ever once heard her use toward me, loud enough to carry across several nearby tables. Dad, this event is for family and major donors. You can wait by the coat check. For a second, I just stood there, hearing every word clearly, but not fully able to process them landing on me. This event is for family. Like I was some stranger who'd wandered in looking for a free meal. Like 31 years of raising her, mostly alone, counted for nothing, measured against how I looked standing at the entrance in work boots. Somebody near the head table laughed first, a short, surprised bark of a sound, and then two or three more voices joined in. Not cruel exactly, more the careless kind of laughter people offer when they think a joke's been made at somebody else's expense, and nobody wants to be the one who doesn't get it. Gordon Callahan didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either. Just watched with that same unreadable expression, 70 years old and comfortable enough in his own skin to let a moment play itself out without stepping in. I looked past Renee at that ballroom full of string lights and champagne flutes, at Preston not quite meeting my eyes, at my two grandkids sitting near the head table looking confused about why Grandpa wasn't coming to sit with them. Not one person in that room knew that the glass walls around them, the 12th floor office, the name etched in gold on the door downstairs, existed because I'd signed my house over to a bank more than a decade earlier. Nobody knew because Renee had made very sure of that from the beginning. Standing near that entrance, I felt something shift inside me, quiet and cold and entirely clear. Not anger, exactly. More like finally seeing something for precisely what it was. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice or cause a scene, because that has never been who I am. I just nodded once, slow, and started turning toward the door, telling myself I'd wait in the truck until it was over, or maybe just drive home and let the whole thing go the way I'd let so many things go over the years. That's when the event coordinator, a young woman named Priya who'd worked every Ashcroft function for the past 3 years and had seen me quietly settle vendor accounts at these gatherings more times than Renee probably remembered, walked over, holding her clipboard. Out of pure habit, the same habit built over years of watching me handle the details whenever Renee got too busy managing the room to notice, Priya walked straight past Renee and held that clipboard out toward me. She didn't even look up from her notes, just said the venue balance needed a signature, and that she appreciated me covering it again this year like always. I looked down at that clipboard sitting there in her hands, and something about it landed different than it ever had before. A four-figure venue balance for an event I'd just been told I wasn't welcome to attend, in a building that existed entirely because of the risk and the money that had come from me in the first place. I took the pen, signed my name where it asked for the account holder, exactly the way I'd done a dozen times before without thinking twice about it. And then I set the pen down gently on the table and looked at Renee the whole time I did it. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I turned, walked past the confused faces and the string lights, out through the kitchen service corridor because it was closer than winding back through the ballroom, and out into the cold spring air of the parking lot, leaving that clipboard sitting exactly where I'd left it. The drive home was quiet in a way I don't think I'd ever experienced before. Not an angry quiet, something stiller and deeper than that. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove through the dark with my hands steady on the wheel, replaying the whole scene over in my head. The laughter, Gordon Callahan's unreadable face, Priya holding that clipboard out without any idea what she'd just walked into. By the time I pulled into my own driveway 40 minutes later, something inside me had gone completely still, the way a pond goes still right before the surface freezes over. I sat in my truck in the dark for a long while before going inside. I thought about Diane, gone all these years now, and how I'd never once let myself fall apart in front of Renee, how I'd swallowed every hard thing quietly so she'd never have to carry any part of it herself. I thought about remortgaging this exact house, about signing a $1.8 million personal guarantee at a bank downtown while a loan officer half my age walked me through the risk like I hadn't already understood every bit of it. I thought about being introduced as a family friend at my own daughter's wedding. Around 11 that night, I called Harold Weiss, an old buddy from my bowling league who also happened to be a business attorney with almost 30 years handling exactly this kind of matter. Harold picked up on the third ring, voice rough with sleep, asking right away what was wrong, because I never called that late unless something actually was. I told him I needed to come into his office first thing in the morning, that I needed him to pull the paperwork on a holding company called Ashcroft Holdings, and that I needed to understand exactly what rights I still had as a 35% owner who'd just been treated like he owned nothing at all. Harold's office sat above an old hardware store downtown, worn leather chairs and diplomas on the wall that had yellowed a little at the corners from age. I sat across from him the next morning while he spread the Ashcroft paperwork across his desk. The same documents I'd signed 9 years earlier without reading every line quite as closely as I probably should have. Harold read through it slowly, tapping certain pages, asking questions about exactly what had happened at that gala, and I told him the whole thing without leaving anything out. He found what he was looking for about 15 minutes in, tapping a clause in the operating agreement with the cap of his pen. "Walter," he said, looking up over his reading glasses, "your personal guarantee on that credit line isn't permanent. It's tied to an annual renewal the bank requires, on account of the collateral being your house. Comes up for review again in 6 weeks. You've also got a buyout clause in here that lets you force a valuation and either buy out the majority partner's share or sell yours, if certain conditions are met, including material misrepresentation of ownership to third parties." Which sounds like exactly what's been happening with these business journal features and everything else. I sat with that information a long moment, feeling something settle into place inside my chest. I told Harold I wanted to withdraw my personal guarantee formally, in writing, through the proper channels, when the renewal came up. No shouting, no scene, just the plain mechanics of a man removing his name from something he never should have hidden behind in the first place. I also asked him to draft a letter invoking the buyout clause, giving Renee the option to purchase my 35% stake at fair market value within 90 days, or the entire ownership structure would go into public filing through the standard process. Harold nodded and told me he'd have the paperwork ready within the week. For the first time since walking out of that ballroom, I felt something close to calm settle over me. The renewal letter went out from the bank exactly on schedule 6 weeks later, informing Ashcroft Holdings that the personal guarantee backing their credit line would not be renewed under current terms, and that the firm would need to secure new collateral or a new guarantor within 30 days to avoid the line being called for immediate repayment. I heard from Harold that Renee's loan officer called him directly the same afternoon the letter arrived, walking her through exactly whose signature had been holding the whole structure together since the very beginning. Renee had never actually studied those original loan documents closely. Not really. She'd signed where Harold and I told her to sign back when she was 24, and desperate to open her first office, trusting that her father had handled the fine print the way I'd handled every detail of her life up to that point. Now, 9 years later, sitting across from a loan officer explaining that the entire financial foundation of her 3 offices rested on her father's house and her father's credit, Renee was hearing the full truth of her own success story for the first time in her life. According to Harold, who'd gotten a call from the bank's legal department confirming receipt of our buyout letter that same week, Renee went pale sitting in that meeting and asked to see the original documents pulled up on the screen in front of her. She sat there in silence for nearly a full minute, staring at my signature across page after page, at the house on our old street listed as collateral, at the 35% ownership stake that had been sitting quietly under her father's name since before Ashcroft Capital ever opened its doors. Whatever story she'd built about herself over the past 9 years, the self-made narrative she'd fed to journalists and in-laws alike, was sitting right there in black and white, unraveling in front of her completely. Renee called me 14 times over the next 3 days, and I let every single one go to voicemail, not out of spite. I genuinely had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said standing at that ballroom entrance. On the fourth day, she showed up at my house unannounced, standing on the porch where I'd stood so many times waiting for her to come home from school, except now the roles felt strange and reversed in a way neither of us was used to. She looked different than she had at the gala. The polish worn thin, dark circles under her eyes like sleep had been avoiding her for days. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about the bank letter. About the buyout thing your attorney sent." I invited her in, made 2 cups of coffee the way I always had, and sat across from her at the same kitchen table where she'd once asked me to sign my life over to help her chase a dream. She asked why I was doing this now, after everything, after all the years I'd stayed quiet and let things be however she needed them to be. I told her the truth, plain and steady, the way I'd learned to say hard things over a lifetime of not saying them soon enough. I told her I wasn't doing anything to her. I was just done doing something for her that she'd never once acknowledged. Done being a silent partner in a life where I wasn't even allowed to stand near the table. I told her pulling my guarantee wasn't revenge. It was just me finally treating my own name and my own house the way she'd taught me. She treated me as something to be used quietly and kept out of sight whenever convenient. She sat there a long while without answering, staring into her coffee. And for the first time in years, I watched my daughter actually run out of words. Word travels fast in circles like the Callahans. Within 2 weeks of that bank letter going out, Gordon Callahan had heard the whole story, not from me, but from his own attorney, who'd caught wind of the loan situation through mutual contacts in the finance community. Gordon called Preston directly one evening and asked him point blank whether it was true that the entire Ashcroft Capital operation had been built on his father-in-law's personal guarantee and hidden ownership stake, the same father-in-law Renee had introduced at her own wedding as nothing more than a family friend. I heard about that conversation secondhand, weeks later, through Preston, who called me one afternoon sounding shaken in a way I'd never once heard from him before. He told me Gordon had always respected self-made success above nearly anything else in this world, that it was the entire foundation of how the Callahan family measured a person's worth, and that discovering Renee's success had actually been quietly financed and guaranteed by a father she'd erased from the public story, had shifted something permanent in how Gordon viewed his daughter-in-law. Preston said Gordon had used the word disappointed, which apparently in that family carried more weight than anger ever could. Gordon Callahan, I learned, had built his own insurance empire from a single rented storefront after his own father lost the family's original business in a bad string of investments decades back. And the one thing he could not tolerate, above almost any other flaw a person could carry, was someone who erased the people who'd actually made their success possible. Renee had spent 9 years building an image of herself as exactly that kind of self-made woman, in front of exactly the kind of family who valued that story above nearly everything else. Now, the whole foundation of that image had cracked open in front of the very people whose respect she'd been chasing the entire time. The downtown Ashcroft office, the same one housing the ballroom where I'd been told to wait by the coat check, closed within 5 months without my guarantee behind it. Renee, never having built enough independent credit or reserves of her own, after years of assuming her father's name would quietly cover whatever gaps appeared, the bank called the line when she couldn't secure new collateral in time. The satellite office across the state line followed 2 months after that, and only the original storefront location survived, scaled back and running with a skeleton staff. Preston didn't leave her, but something between them had shifted permanently, the way he told it to me later. He said discovering the truth about the offices had made him look back at their whole marriage differently, wondering what else Renee had let him believe that wasn't quite the full picture. Gordon, according to Preston, had pulled back significantly from the informal introductions and social capital he used to extend to Renee freely, treating her now with a careful, watchful distance instead of the warmth he'd shown before. Renee lost weight over those months, showed up to a few family gatherings looking smaller somehow. The sharp confidence that used to fill a room, replaced by something more careful and uncertain. I didn't take any pleasure in watching it happen, and I want to be honest about that, because I'd spent too many years loving that girl to feel good about any part of her life falling apart. But I also didn't step in to soften any of it, because for the first time in her adult life, Renee was standing in front of consequences that belonged entirely to her, built from choices she'd made without me standing quietly behind her, covering the gaps. Renee came back to the house on a Sunday afternoon in early fall, parking on the street instead of the driveway like she used to, and knocked on the front door instead of just walking in the way she'd done her whole life growing up in that house. I opened the door and found her standing there in a plain sweater. No polish left in how she carried herself. Just a tired woman in her 30s who looked for the first time in a long while like she actually wanted to say something true. We sat on the back porch where I used to watch her do homework at a folding table on summer evenings, and she talked for almost an hour without me interrupting once. She told me she'd been ashamed of where we came from since she was a kid, ashamed of the truck and the work boots and the plant floor smell that never quite washed out, and that shame had turned into something uglier over the years. A need to erase the parts of her story that felt too plain for the world she wanted to belong to. She said she understood now that erasing me from that story meant erasing the only person who'd ever shown up for her without conditions. And she said she was sorry in a way that didn't sound rehearsed or convenient, just plain and a little broken. I told her I appreciated hearing that, and that I believed her, but that things weren't going back to exactly how they'd been before that gala. I told her if she wanted me in her life going forward, it would have to be as her father out loud in front of whoever happened to be in the room, not as a quiet arrangement she pulled out when it was useful and hid away when it wasn't. She nodded, and for the first time, in longer than I could remember, she reached over and hugged me the way she used to as a kid, not performing anything for anyone, just two people sitting on a porch, trying to find their way back to something honest. It's been almost a year now since that gala at the downtown office, and things look different than they used to, though not in the way a magazine feature would ever write it up. Renee runs the one remaining office herself now, without my guarantee behind it, working the kind of long hours I used to work back when she was a kid, watching me leave the house before sunrise. She calls me most weeks now. Actually calls, not just when something's needed. And last month, she introduced me to a new client at the office as my dad. Plain and simple. No family friend, no careful editing of the truth. Gordon Callahan and I have actually spoken a handful of times since everything settled, and I found him to be a far more decent man than that first impression at the gala suggested. The kind of person who respects somebody more once he understands what they actually built with their own two hands. He told me once, over coffee Renee had arranged a little awkwardly between the two of us, that he wished he'd known the real story years earlier. That a machinist who remortgaged his house for his daughter's dream deserved more respect at that table than most of the people who'd been laughing that evening ever did. I still drive the same old truck with the dent in the tailgate I never got around to fixing. I still come home most days with grease worked into my knuckles from whatever job I'm on. But I sit at family gatherings now without wondering whether I actually belong there, because Renee finally understands what it costs to build the life she has. And she's stopped pretending that cost might belong to her alone. Some nights I think back to standing near that ballroom entrance, hearing my own daughter tell me to wait by the coat check, and I realize that moment didn't destroy anything that was actually worth keeping. It just finally showed me, clear as anything, exactly what needed to change, and gave me the push to change it.